There are many different spiritual systems in the world that have different types of initiation programs that a person goes through. And the Rosicrucian system is one that's been very influential in the West, but actually it's sometimes hard to get information about what their actual system of development is. Some of the classical depictions of initiation processes coming from European alchemy and from the Rosicrucian tradition. And these often present in an allegorical form the different types of stages one goes through for spiritual development. The Rosicrucian tradition is one of the most recent of the great traditions on the planet. If you go back to the Vedic tradition in India, Tibetan tradition, etc., many others, they're very ancient. But the Rosicrucian tradition really only broke the surface in human history in the 1600s. The Rosicrucian organization wasn't connected to any one authoritative teacher, and it wasn't connected to any particular type of control structure. There was no institution for it. It was really a very free and independent path of modern initiation. What do we actually mean by initiation or an initiate? Because the terms are used very generally in modern metaphysical circles. But if you look at people that are being presented as initiates, they are often extremely different. One technical part of this is actually the structure of their consciousness, and the structure of their subtle bodies can be quite different from one to another, although they're being presented as initiates within different systems. So one of the discernment points that we have within the Rosicrucian system is that there are three different aspects of initiation or becoming an initiate. In one of these, what is actually being illuminated begins with the thinking process, with actually knowing about non-physical realities, knowing about the greater spiritual realities that we come from, and the spiritual depths of oneself. This is linked to the spiritual centers inside the head, and this is also linked to the illumination of the thinking process, so that with this process we actually know consciously the structure of the spiritual worlds, how we interact with them, how they influence us on a daily basis. And within this Rosicrucian system, that would technically be known as an initiate, someone that actually understands the systems. And that's one reason why you find in so much of the classical depictions all these presentations of different types of patterns, one pattern within another, often represented within sacred geometric forms. And within Western Europe, often sacred geometric forms that hold inside of them Hebrew letters that are a representation of certain states of consciousness, spiritual beings, things of that kind. This is because in this path of illumination, we find that everything is a thought form from the mind of God, and all those thought forms have a pattern to them. And the current term that we use for understanding those patterns is sacred geometry. So sacred geometry is a universal science for understanding the patterns of creation at every level, whether it's how the different spirituals are constructed, or different ranks of spiritual beings and their consciousness, or the different subtle bodies of a human being. And so no matter what tradition you study with, they will work with sacred geometry, because the sacred geometry at the highest level is a pure packed thought form from the mind of God that shows you the pure pattern of everything that's manifested from it. Now the next level is that of the clairvoyant. And from one perspective, we could say this is linked to the illumination of the heart and the feeling life. The Rosicrucians talk about a process within an initiation in which at a certain point, when the heart becomes open and unarmored, and we cultivate this feeling of unconditional love, there is an ignition of a kind of spiritual spark within the heart. And what happens then is that they describe it as an etheric rose light arises from the heart and moves up to what's commonly called the third eye center. And with that rose etheric stream, it enters into the centers in the head, that area that is technically at the third ventricle of the brain and was known as the cave of Brahma in the Indian teachings. This is a particular area that's open in the head that has a space between the pineal and pituitary glands. And as this space becomes illuminated, it leads to direct spiritual vision. The clairvoyant can actually perceive non-physical realities. The third aspect here is that there's also the cultivation of action or of the will. And this is linked to the belly, or what in Japan they call the hara, or in Chinese alchemy they call the lower dantian. And through the action or willing form of illumination, one is able to take action esoterically. You're able to actually use non-physical realities to change things on the physical plane. The most extreme form of this, we have things like actual physical alchemy and the transmutation of one physical substance to another. But this is usually attained after going through multiple steps of being able to transform something that is less dense, and that is normally etheric energy fields. So the actual vibrational transformation of energy fields, energy healing, things of that kind, is something that you find very strongly on this path. So the person that can actually transform things using spiritual forces is referred to as the adept. There's a reason why we're emphasizing the head, the heart, and the hara. When you study classical spiritual text, you find that they divide up the aspects of the human being into different types of forces. So the actual consciousness of the human being is often referred to as the astral body, and it's related to what's often called the spiritual plane of the astral plane. Within the Rosicrucian work, you find at a certain point that the consciousness body of the human being has 3 centers that can be worked on and awakened. And those 3 centers are around the head, the heart, and the hara. And this is really a universal teaching. If you study with the Buddhist, they'll talk about the thought, speech, and action. If you study with Sufis, they'll talk about the head, the heart, and the hands. All these different traditions are working with the same concept. If you studied Chinese medicine or Chinese internal alchemy like Qigong, you'll know that they have the upper, middle, and lower Dantian. They refer to these as elixir fields, because when we understand what these actually are energetically, they are a kind of spiritual elixir field that we can work in and illuminate the forces of. Depending on where we focus on primarily, we can first begin to develop the capacity of understanding things in a conscious manner, the patterns behind them, become the initiate, or directly perceive spiritual realities, the clairvoyant, or directly manipulate the spiritual forces, hopefully for a good outcome, and that's the adept. This is really a path of direct connection to spirit by understanding spiritual processes. When we go through a process of initiation, initiation is really a process of becoming aware of who am I, why am I here, where do I come from, and how do I develop a process by which I can become more self-aware and accelerate my process of development. Along the path of initiation, as you begin to understand processes other people don't understand, there can be the temptation to use that knowledge to manipulate other people, or to manipulate all types of things. Let's say you understand psychology and somebody else doesn't. You can manipulate them with all types of things in neurolinguistic programming and things of that kind. What words do you use? What tonality do you use? How do you present the information? You can manipulate them all over the place. And so in Rosicrucianism, there's a very strong rule that all the powers and understandings gained on the path will be put to the service of other people. And so that's like the first rule in Rosicrucianism. Otherwise, as you develop the abilities, you will get that temptation of, well, I could get what I want right now because they don't understand this process, but I do. So initiation and inner alchemy. Alchemy has to do with the transformation of something from a base state to a higher state. But there's an important thing that's hidden in that, which is that the base state has to exist first. You're turning lead into gold, but there had to be the lead there first to create the gold. So this means that hidden within, all types of lower structures are the seed of its full fruition, very much like the classical illustration of the caterpillar and the butterfly. You know, you don't know looking at the caterpillar that over time its entire structure has laid within it the ability to become a winged butterfly. But it's the exact same thing in the human being, which is why they depicted the higher spiritual bodies of the human being as always being with wings, traveling through the spiritual worlds. So we develop the physical body. We develop the body of life force. We develop our consciousness. And in the Rosicrucian work, there's very detailed descriptions of earlier stages of evolution. And it relates to things like Eastern teachings about the great Manvantaras, stages of planetary evolution, in which all these things were laid down at an earlier time. But then we come to the point of developing our self-awareness, the I am presence. And that's where we are today. Human beings have developed this, and now we're at this critical point of developing the I am self-awareness, which the Rosicrucians see as being the true message of Christianity. The Rosicrucians see the whole issue of Jesus and Christ being a particular human being of Yeshua ben Joseph, a rabbi who had developed to the point of being able to actually unify himself energetically and in consciousness with the being of the Christ. Now, who is the Christ? It's related to what I referred to before in the Zoroastrian tradition with the Ahura Mazda, the aura of the sun, and the classical tradition of the sun god. Because it was understood in the ancient traditions this was not something pagan, in the detrimental way we use that term sometimes today in the West, but rather this had to do with the whole way that God manifests in the world. And so if we look at our local system, the solar system, everything moves around the sun. And the sun is the inexhaustible source of life in the solar system. It is light and it is heat. Without that light and heat, we would have no life here. And it was understood that if you actually literally look into the energetic aura of the sun, there are spiritual beings of such a high nature that it would be very difficult for them to manifest into denser bodies. They need something of that level to match their own nature. And this is connected to certain of the spiritual hierarchies and to the Christ being. So when they tried to understand this whole mystery of what is the Christ in the early Christian centuries, there was a wonderful text written by one of the great early church fathers in Egypt, whose name was Origen. And Origen wrote a book called On First Principles. And in the book On First Principles, he gives a very simple and beautiful description of how can we understand what the Christ being is. The Christ being is nothing other than a being emanated from the Godhead that has all the qualities of the Godhead in a unified form, but reduced in scale to where human beings can directly interact with this being. Because it was understood originally that the Godhead is everything. The Godhead is literally everything everywhere. But you take those qualities and you create a being that has that at the macrocosmic level, and that was understood to be the Christ being. And then the human being was actually the microcosm of that emanated Godhead. We are the crown of creation, etc. And so what this means in the early Christian centuries is they understood the Christ as being of the exact same nature as the human being. The Christ is almost a kind of oversoul of all human beings at the macrocosmic level. We all connect to the Christ being. And one of the things that Rosicrucians lament is that this impulse came in from lower states of consciousness trying to understand the teachings in Christianity that then somehow made Christianity something that was a separate sect, separate from other sects, which was not the initial concept. The initial concept is that the Christ being is the actual higher consciousness aspect that is a living being at a higher macrocosmic level that every human being is connected to. It's not something for one particular set-aside group of people. Some might be more conscious of it than others, but from the perspective of a Rosicrucian, you can find people that are more deeply connected to Christ than someone that says they're Christian, who are Buddhist, Hindus, whatever. It has to do with their illumination of consciousness and what they're resonant with. And so it's a thing of this actual manifestation of the Godhead at a higher level that has all the qualities of the Godhead so we can interact with it, reduced in scale. This I am self-awareness is something that is related to the entire Christ mystery, building through the Jewish text and then into the esoteric Christian text. So again, the 7 I am sayings of the book of John are understood by the Rosicrucians not to be that you have to pledge some type of loyalty to Jesus Christ as a kind of master in order to not be tortured or to die forever, but rather it's a matter of the I am is the way and the light. The I am is the resurrection and the life. That it's that spark of the divine inside of us that's of the exact same nature as the Christ being. There is no separation between them. They're both emanation from the same ocean of fire. That's the consciousness of God. That's the essence of all of this. And that's the stage we're at today. So the Rosicrucians see this as the point we're at where we have to illuminate our awareness, to actually illuminate that spark. Now, we've gone through a process where actually we have become more and more individualized. And when we actually pass through this stage at a higher level, we first become more deeply self-aware, but then we actually become aware in a transpersonal way. So not all of ourselves is so focused. But first it starts with focus on the self. Now the inner alchemy of this is that once we have developed that fire, and this is represented in the esoteric Christian tradition as the flame above the head of the disciples at Pentecost. It's a literal flame that ignites a spiritual structure that moves in a vertical axis through the human body. And at this energy center above the human head, it illuminates to be the center of the Holy Spirit and its ignition into higher consciousness. This is a particular way it can be presented in the Western understanding. So as we develop that aspect of ourselves that's of the same nature as the Christ, same nature as the Godhead, can now illuminate with light and transform with the fire the lower bodies. That means that then we can train our I am spiritual self-awareness to actually transform our consciousness to a higher level. It's an alchemical transformation of the consciousness to become something different of a higher nature. And then it can then transform our entire body of life force, the entire etheric body, chi, ki, prana, to a higher level. And then it can actually transform the physical body That's what in esoteric Christianity is referred to as the resurrection body of the Christ after the crucifixion, and sometimes in the esoteric text is referred to as the phantom body. To first start to analyze our own internal life, we have to be aware of, what am I thinking, what am I feeling, what am I doing? Because most of the time we're completely unconscious. These are the kind of things that you find in many traditions, like in the work of Gurdjieff. If you look at the foundations of Gurdjieff's work, he talks about the fact that the terror of the situation, in his terms, is that the whole human race is asleep. We think we're awake and we're walking around in the world, but we're still fast asleep, and we just keep playing out the same reactive psychological patterns again and again and again. So we have to go through a process that he calls waking up and becoming self-aware. And so we start simply observing ourselves. So the process of self-observation is fundamental in just about all classical initiation traditions. Without self-observation, you can't begin to crystallize out this level of awareness, and you can't start changing your detrimental psychological patterns of how you think and how you speak and how you interact with people and how you feel internally to something that's more beneficial. Now, over time, this develops to a higher level, to where your awareness actually becomes transpersonal, so that you're not completely focused on yourself, but rather you can take in the consciousness states of more and more people. This also develops into being able to think in a way that goes beyond simple mechanical thinking in our mind. It's what the Rosicrucians call sense-free thinking. It means that we can think in terms of pure archetypes. Our mind can now access the pure archetypes from the mind of God. And that's what sacred geometry was understood to be by the Greeks. So what to us seems like a very abstract philosophy. What are they talking about? They're meditating on ideal types and all these geometric forms. What are the Greeks doing with that? Why are they wasting their time with it? They understood that what they're actually meditating on was sense-free thinking, being able to actually go into resonance with the actual forms from the mind of God that hold the patterns of everything in the world. It's a communion with the mind of God. And so true sacred geometry was always on that level. And this can also give rise to something called the new clairvoyance, because the whole path of clairvoyance has changed over time. Because our state of consciousness used to be different, our way that we could perceive things spiritually was also different. As our consciousness changes, how we can perceive things spiritually transforms over time. And again, the I Am can transform our life force, and it transforms our life body into what is sometimes referred to as the immortal body. It has different names in different traditions. And then transforms the physical. One of the Rosicrucian practices, as far as practical exercises, is that they examine things in the living world to see the stages that it moves through. Because they understand that within a seed is the complete pattern matrix for everything that seed will ever do once it begins to grow and sprout and blossom and fruit and wither and decay and disappear. All those stages are hidden within the seed. And so all things go through this process. So when we observe the growth of a child, we see all of these stages one after another in a lawful process. The life of every human being, from an infant to old age, is a microcosmic fractal of what we go through over great periods of time in spiritual development. It follows a particular trajectory. So to clarify some of this, and this is a very general gloss on it, we descend originally from spirit to earth. And with human development, we went through a particular process that in the Indian tradition is referred to as Kali Yuga. This Kali Yuga spiritual tradition was understood as being the spiritual dark age. And depending on which of the Indian teachers you talk to, some say that we're still in Kali Yuga and will be for a long time to come. Others, such as in the Sri Yukteswar Babaji lineage, say that it's actually already ended. And actually the timing of the Kali Yuga Dark Age for human evolution is exactly the same for the ending point between the European Rosicrucians and the Babaji Sri Yukteswar lineage. So in this Kali Yuga Dark Age, we had a particular situation take place. In the early times, human beings were not self-aware. You study ancient texts, they're always identifying themselves with the tribe, the group. I am so-and-so, the Philistine, the Semite, whatever it might be. They always identify with the group. In ancient Greece, to be exiled from your city was like a fate worse than death. Today, it's like, you're not going to put me in jail, I just get to leave the city? Great, I'm gone. But for them, to be separated from the group was terrible. It was a punishment because they had a group consciousness. So they weren't self-aware, but what they did have in early times was a lot of clairvoyance. And so you still see this with some of the traditional peoples on the earth today. those traditional peoples preserve this type of native clairvoyance that can be quite strong. And the Rosicrucians see as actually as being related to the blood in a particular way. What happens over time is that as we become more self-aware, we're not fully self-aware, but we're moving toward it. We're becoming more individual in our self-awareness. This leads to what the great teachers in ancient India referred to as the Kali Yuga Dark Age, because literally the clairvoyance is going dark. The people in India are losing their clairvoyant faculties, and we can no longer directly see spirit. And so there's a kind of a panic that you can see in some of these old texts that leads to the teaching of, well, the physical world's an illusion. You're about to get stranded here. This is actually a place of suffering. So get off the cycle of karma and reincarnation, off the suffering, and just go back to the spiritual world, to nirvana permanently. But it was not understood the complete sequence of this, at least the way the Rosicrucians see it. So human beings began to more and more lose the ability to clairvoyantly perceive the world around them, but they developed the ability to think in a logical, linear way and to think of themselves as more of a separate individual being. This develops over time until we reach a kind of a low point of this that is the nadir point that the Rosicrucians see as what happened around the time of the incarnation of the Christ being within Jesus of Nazareth. That is a human being attaining the state that creates the template for the rest of humanity to actually unite with the Christ being and develop that state of awareness. And so there's actually two different movements happening here simultaneously. There's an ascending movement and a descending movement. Our capacity for developing higher consciousness is going up at the same time as, in a way, we're contracting into more and more of an individual contracted state. So at the time that we become the most individual, the most separated, the difficulty of that is we lose perception of the spiritual world, and we lose a sense of connection to everything that is. The benefit of it is that it sharpens our self-awareness. It sharpens our ability to think and to be conscious in a particular way that could only happen this way. So once that happens and we can begin to crystallize the I am self-awareness, and we truly become self-aware, self-conscious, then two things can happen. Either we keep going down and we become more and more self-involved and become more materialistic, or we can begin to pull back up as that I am presence fully develops, and instead of just becoming a lower and lower beast-like form of being separate from everything, it instead becomes a transcendental consciousness where now with the fully awakened logical linear thinking and the ability to be self-aware, we can now fully awaken the I am inside of us and connect not just to ourselves, but start to expand back out to be transpersonal in our awareness. Now that I am self-awareness can begin to transform our consciousness. So our detrimental thinking patterns, where we think very negatively, and we ascribe all types of angry and negative types of aspects to the people around us and to the things of the world around us, we can begin to transform that and illuminate it. Again, then we transform the life body and transform the physical body. And the idea is that once you can awaken that I am inside through certain processes, then the task is to connect directly to spirit and not have to do it through connecting through another human being that'll then connect you to spirit. And so what this is meant to do is it illuminates the thinking. Again, not as just a type of intellectual activity, but to where the intellect develops to where it actually becomes clairvoyant.